It can't be anything else. Cyst I smell. That's got to be it. Cyst I smell. Final answer. Hello, and welcome to Action Surge, the series where we take an in-depth look at your turn in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Today we are going to be looking at the Cast a Spell action. The Cast a Spell action is going to be used anytime you are trying to weave magic in your world. Whether it's something like a lowly cantrip that can be used as many times per day as you desire, or if you're starting to break out that wallet and spend those spell slots on something a bit more powerful, we're going to discuss it. First of all, let's head on over and look at the mechanics of this action. Looking at the mechanics of spellcasting, we will start by addressing the elephant in the room. Not all of these are going to be actions. Each spell has a casting time, which specifies whether the caster must use an action, a reaction, minutes, or even hours to cast the spell. Casting a spell is therefore not necessarily an action, though most spells do have a casting time of 1 action, so a spellcaster often uses his or her action in combat to cast such a spell. Most spells require a single action to cast, but some spells require a bonus action, a reaction, or much more time to cast. At the end of this section, we will look at what makes each of these other casting times unique. For now, though, we are going to break down what you need to know when you choose to cast a spell as your action, and we're going to break this down to 3 groups. What you need to cast the spell, spell slots and components, who it can affect, range, targets, and area of effect, and determining if it can affect them through saving throws, attack rolls, and duration. We will start with what you need to cast a spell. Each spellcasting class's description, except that of the Warlock, includes a table showing how many spell slots of each spell level a character can use at each character level. When a character casts a spell, he or she must expend a slot of that spell's level or higher, effectively filling a slot with that spell. You can think of a spell slot as a groove of a certain size, small for a first level slot, larger for a spell of higher level. A first level spell fits into a slot of any size, but a 9th level spell fits only in a 9th level slot. A cantrip is a spell that will be cast at will without using a spell slot. Repeated practice has fixed the spell in the caster's mind and infused the caster with the magic needed to produce the effect over and over. Functionally, a cantrip's spell level is 0, as it takes up no space in the spell slots available. Components. A spell's components are the physical requirements you must meet in order to cast it. Each spell's description indicates whether it requires a verbal component, a somatic component, or a material component. If you can't provide one or more of the spell's components, you are unable to cast the spell. Most spells require the chanting of mystic words. A character who is gagged or in an area of silence can't cast a spell with a verbal component. Spellcasting gestures might include a forceful gesticulation or an intricate set of gestures. The caster must have free use of at least one hand to perform these gestures, the somatic component. Objects hold potential in the worlds of D&D, and some spells require you have something to focus your magic. A material component is a component that a character must have in order to cast these spells. A character can use a component pouch or a spell-casting focus in place of the components specified for a spell. If a cost is indicated for a component, a character must have that specific component before he or she can cast the spell. If a spell states that a material component is consumed by the spell, the caster must provide this component for each individual casting of the spell. A spellcaster must have a free hand to access a spell's material components, whether those specified or the arcane focus, and this hand that is using the spellcasting focus can also be the same hand used to perform the somatic components of a somatic component requiring spell. Now we're going to move on to what all is affected by a spell when it is cast. The first thing to account for is how far you can cast the spell out from you. A spell's range determines how far out from you a target can be. But what is a target? A typical spell requires you to pick one or more targets to be affected by the spell's magic. A spell's description tells you whether the spell targets creatures, objects, or a point of origin in an area of effect. Creatures and objects are easy to pick out, but what is an area of effect? An area of effect is a shape in three-dimensional space that affects everyone in it. Like the difference of a little squirt gun or a fire engine's hose, a squirt gun may target a single creature, where the fire hose targets everyone in that general area. A spell's description specifies its area of effect, which typically has one of 5 different shapes: a cone, a cube, a cylinder, a line, or a sphere. Every area of effect has a point of origin, a location from which the spell's energy erupts. The rules for each shape specify how you position its point of origin in comparison to the rest of the area of effect. Typically, a point of origin is a point in space, but some spells have an area whose origin is a creature or an object. Further specifics on the different shapes that can be found are on page 204 and 205 of the player's handbook. After knowing who all is possibly affected by a spell, we have to determine whether or not it worked. A d20 will usually be rolled for every target to determine if they were affected independently. What changes will be whether the spellcaster is going to make an attack roll or if the target will make a saving throw to resist the effect. Some spells require the caster to make an attack roll to determine whether the spell effect hits the intended target. Your attack bonus with a spell attack equals your spellcasting ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus. Aside from your to-hit bonus on the d20, these attack rolls follow all the same rules as a weapon-based attack. Many spells specify that a target can make a saving throw to avoid some or all of a spell's effects. The spell specifies the ability that the target uses for the save and what happens on a success or failure. The DC, or number needed to be rolled to resist the spell, is equal to 8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus. In other words, it is typically 8 plus your spell attack roll. Many spells will state if there is a secondary effect related to resisting the spell. If one isn't stated, nothing else happens. A spell's duration describes how long this magic lasts. This is important to determine if there is a way of ending the effect early. A duration can be expressed in rounds, minutes, hours, or even years. Some spells specify that their effects last until the spells are dispelled or destroyed. Instantaneous effects happen in an instant and therefore cannot be dispelled or destroyed. Their damage is already done. Alternatively, spells with a duration requiring concentration can be ended early by disturbing or harming the caster before the maximum duration is reached. You can read more about concentration spells on page 203 and 204 of the player's handbook. Other casting times. I promised that we'd get back to this. A spell cast with a bonus action is an especially swift item. You must use a bonus action on your turn to cast the spell, provided that you haven't already taken a bonus action this turn. You can't cast another spell during the same turn except for a cantrip with a casting time of 1 action. While casting that spell with a bonus action might be pretty fast, it does limit what other magic you can do on that turn. Some spells can be cast as reactions. These spells take a fraction of a second to bring about and are cast in response to some event. If a spell can be cast as a reaction, the spell's description tells you exactly when you can do so. As a note, we have not talked about reactions yet. Reactions are something that can happen on your turn, but typically happen not on your turn. You get 1 reaction per round, and it comes back at the beginning of your turn. If for whatever reason you happen to cast a reaction spell on your turn, you cannot do so again until it's your turn again in the initiative order. Certain spells, including spells cast as rituals, require more time to cast, minutes or even hours. When you cast a spell with a casting time longer than a single action or reaction, you must spend your action each turn casting that spell, and you must maintain your concentration while doing so. If your concentration is broken, the spell fails, but you don't expend the spell slot. If you want to try casting the spell again, you have to start over from the beginning of the time limit. Longer casting times are important to understand for ritual spells. You can read more about ritual spells on page 201 and 202 of the Player's Handbook. Okay, now that we've looked at the mechanic of the cast a spell action, let's talk about when you're going to want to use it. Similar to martial characters with their attack action, any spellcasting character is going to be using the cast a spell action a lot. Now, to pretend like I can tell you when to use every single spell, that's too big of a task. Magic in D&D can do everything from harming to healing. It can change a battlefield or open up solutions that otherwise weren't even there in the first place. Rather than talking about when you're going to want to use any particular spell, we're going to talk about how often you want to use your spells. With this, we're going to break down your adventures into two groups: active adventures and passive adventures. An active adventure is going to be anytime you are in the middle of something. You're going to be going through multiple dangerous encounters in any given adventuring day. This is going to be when you are down in a dungeon, when you are pulling a heist, protecting a village, or you are in the middle of something intense where there's a whole bunch of things going on. Opposite of that, we do have the passive adventure. A passive adventure is going to be any of your adventuring days during the game where you really only do one or two things before you move on to the next day. This is going to be between your active adventures. This is going to be when either you don't have another goal and you're looking for that goal, or you may have something in the distance, but you're trying to figure out how to get that done. This is going to be after you finish a dungeon and then you are going and talking to the wizard who sent you there and figuring out what they need next. This could be after you finish up a big political story, you find a dead body, and now you have to figure out what to do with it. You have to figure out if you're going to catch the killer, you're going to have to figure out who this person was. Those are passive adventures. You may be going through only one or two things on any given day before you take a rest. Because there's a high difference in how many spells you're going to be using in an active adventure versus a passive adventure, that's going to determine what you're using your cast a spell action on. If you are in an active adventure, you're going to want to conserve your resources at least a little bit. And now it's on you to figure out when to start using up the last few resources trying to finish something, whether that is in a big boss battle or escaping to fight another day. But you need to figure out how to partition out your resources so you don't use them all at once. My suggestion, if you are in an active adventure, is that you should only use about a quarter to a third of your highest level resources in any given encounter. Now, if you are a low-level character between levels 1 and 3 or 4, you're not going to have very many spell slots. The highest level spell slots you are going to have is going to be second, maybe third level spell slots. With that, you're not going to want to use a lot. After using one or two second level spells, maybe a third level spell, you're going to want to sit back on your cantrips to conserve your resources. Now, if you're a higher level character, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, as you're getting up there, you have a lot more spell slots at your disposal. In this case, conserving your high level spell slots isn't going to be 2 or 3. It's going to be levels 4, 5, maybe even 6 or 7. If you're limiting yourself to only using about a quarter of those higher level spell slots, in this case 4, 5, 6, somewhere around there, that frees you up what to do with the rest of your time. As opposed to purely casting cantrips on your other turns, you can cast first level and second level spells. It gives you a little bit more leeway since you have more resources to use. Outside of an active adventure, passive adventures, you have more resources than you're probably going to get through in any given day. Rather than fighting resource management, what you are doing is you are fighting time. You are trying to figure out what the next step in your adventure is, and in this case, I suggest you use the highest level spell slots as often as you need. With this, you are going to be going through them a whole lot faster, but you're gonna probably get a rest soon. What you are trying to fight is the waste that could be happening if you are not using your spell slots. If you have 2 or 3 third level spell slots and you have the sending spell, in a passive adventure, it may be well worth your time to cast those sending spells using your highest level spell slots to get the job done. You don't know what the next step is until you knock down a series of barriers, and in order to do this efficiently, you're going to want to use your highest level spell slots that you need to get this done. Understanding whether you are in an active adventure or a passive adventure is going to help you understand which spell slots you want to be using how often. Now, your Dungeon Master may slyly transition you from one category to the other without you fully realizing it, at which point they will have planned ahead of time, knowing that if they are taking you from a passive adventure all of a sudden into an active adventure, they're not going to be punishing you for using your spell slots to go from part A to part B. They're going to be taking care of you along the way, and if they're not, well, yeah, maybe you should always be over here in the active adventure, just to play it safe. Now that we've talked about when to be using your spell slots in your cast a spell action, let's personalize this. Like I said, magic can do a whole lot of things a whole lot of different ways, and let's make your magic your own. So, you've picked the spell you want to use, you're ready to cast it. But what does that look like? I find myself asking my players that many times. What does that look like when you cast that spell? There's only so many spells in the game. I know it probably looks like a lot at the beginning, but when everyone has the same handful of first or second level spells that they tend to use, it can get a little overbearing of the same spell over and over again. With this, the way your character casts their magic is going to change what that spell does in the game. Rather, not what it does, that's the mechanics, but what your characters experience. Understanding how you cast your magic is one thing. There are rules in the player's handbook for the different sources of power that a cleric versus a druid versus a wizard or a sorcerer draws upon. That's not what I'm talking about. Those can easily flavor into how you want to cast your magic, but the descriptions you go with can be further afield than just those stereotypes. Whether you are a wizard or a sorcerer, you can cast your magic in a very purposeful, exact way. You know what to do, how to do it. Alternatively, you could be very chaotic with your magic. It could just suddenly happen. You can get stressed and it bursts out of you. If you're a sorcerer, maybe that's just the power in your bloodline ripping itself out trying to protect you. If you're a wizard, maybe that chaotic burst of magic is something that you are initiating. You are going through the hand signs and the magic words you need to cast spells, but you're not quite certain of how to do it fully. You're still fumbling through it. Aside from a very exact and purposeful method or a very chaotic bursting, we can also describe the aesthetics. Whether it's very much a Marvel Cinematic Universe, Doctor Strange, large geometric symbols and patterns woven through the air, or whether it's something a bit more naturalistic where you just see wisps of energy, like ribbons of prismatic color beginning to come out and do their thing. You might be able to be pulling on different spirits, the spirit of a tree, the spirit of a river, your ancestors, and using that to channel your magic. The way you describe your magic is going to add flavor to your character. In addition to those sorts of things, look at the spells. Look at the components of a spell, as we discussed earlier in the mechanics. If a spell says that it's using a somatic component, a hand sign, if you're describing yourself casting that spell, maybe come up with a hand sign unique to that spell. If it requires verbal components, perhaps come up with what those verbal components are. If it takes a material component, you can either use the material component specific in the spell, such as sulfur and bat guano for the fireball spell, and describe that in your spell casting, or if you're choosing to use an arcane focus, like a wand or a magic orb, you can describe what type of hand motion you do as you use that implement. If you've seen the very first Harry Potter movie, there is a very important moment where they describe both the verbal component of Wingardium Leviosa, the word matters, Additionally, there's the swish and flick component. Both of those matter for how the spell is cast. So how specific you are on how you cast your magic will also tell into the story of what it looks like when you cast your spells versus another member of the party. Other examples of different magic systems might be something like Full Metal Alchemist, which is very much about sigils. Now, you don't have to spend the entire combat writing out a single sigil, but you can use that as a focus for how you're doing it. Similar, if you are familiar with Naruto, they use a lot of hand signs in how they do their magic. All of these are wonderful examples of different ways that you can expound and you can come up with your own personal varieties of what these magic spells look like. Now, not only can you describe how you're casting the magic, but you can change what the magic actually looks like in effect. For instance, let's take the Shield of Faith spell. It is a first level spell, primarily used by clerics and paladins. The Shield of Faith spell just gives you a little bit of an extra armor class, but when you do it, it can look like 1,000 different things. If you are a divine caster, if you are a cleric of a holy god of light, perhaps when you cast the spell, the person you cast it on begins to glow with that holy energy. Perhaps if you are a paladin of war, rather than a glow of energy, it is an actual secondary suit of armor that kind of builds up over the person. Either way, it's the same effect. If you are playing something like an artificer, a very technology-based caster, maybe what you do is you attach a small little box onto the person, and that box produces an energy field that helps ward away, almost like a magnetic field, bouncing weapon attacks away from the target. All of these are different ways of describing the in-game effect of the same exact spell. As you can see, not only do we have a bunch of spells that all have their own flavors, they have their own effects, they have their own components to them to inspire us, but we can describe both the physical casting of the spell and what the spell looks like in practice. You have so much at your disposal, so much freedom of creativity when casting spells that at any point in time, you should be able to take the floor with a wonderful description. Or, if the combat's getting long, it's still okay to say, I cast Magic Missile at the darkness. Well, not the darkness, that's technically not a target, you have to target a creature. Anyways, take as much description as you want, describe what elements fascinate you, and when you're done, let them know how much damage you're doing. And with that, we are done with the Cast a Spell action on Action Surge. We've discussed what it looks like to cast, when you should cast, and what yours looks like to cast. Moving on down our series, we're speeding along into our next unit on the dash action. I hope you catch your breath because we've still got a ways to go. Thank you.